They tell the story of the Imperium in whispers, a slow, grinding litany of names and numbers, of worlds folded into bark and stone and metal until the original faces and voices are almost smoothed away. Tonight, the voice you hear is close and deliberate, measured like a metronome, not to quicken the pulse, but to slow it, to coax your breath into a steady tide. Listen. Breathe. The galaxy is old. The machines remember more than flesh, and in the shadow of Terra, everything waits. Imagine first the night. Not the ordinary night of sun sliding past horizon to horizon. This is a manufactured dark, a black so absolute it seems to drink light. It hangs over a city that has been a city longer than some races have been whole, a crown of towers and buttresses and cathedrals, each layered over the bones of 1,000 monuments. Storm lamps glow weak and orange along terraces where gargoyles watch like tired sentinels. The sky above Terra is a bowl of boiling cloud, streaked with ion light and the slow burn of distant warp glare. Even the stars are careful to hide their faces. You might expect thunder, but the sound here is different. The distant, measured thrum of void engines, like a heartbeat beneath stone. The air tastes of ozone and hot metal. It carries, muted in the alleys and under the arches, the smell of oil and incense and old blood. The scent that clings to sanctums where men pray with tools and relics. Somewhere high, where the cathedral ramps level and the bronze angels peer down, there is the faint hiss of servo gear, the click of a reliquary opening. The great city breathes through pipes and pumps. Its lungs are foundries and bellows and the slow pumps of augmetic hearts. This is not the world of simple comforts. It is a world built upon the belief that to survive is to become less human. It is a creed draped in plate and hymn and ritualized litany. Here, the sound of prayer is sometimes a pneumatic hiss, the psalm transmitted through conduits, read aloud by the voice of a cogitator. Here, sacraments are performed with spanners and wire. The machine god is invoked with the same cadence as any saint, but it is colder. It offers patterns and certainty where flesh offers only fever. And yet, for all its Baroque mechanica, there is a fragile tenderness in the smallest things. A child's toy carved from corroded brass, a faded portrait stitched into a spacer's jacket, an old sergeant humming a hymn under his breath while polishing a bolter. The Imperium does not permit gentleness easily. It sprinkles it in hidden places where the living can remember their names. The siege has been long. The word siege is itself an old instrument of patience, a measured application of pressure until stone gives way or the defender's wills are whittled down. There are sieges that last weeks, months, centuries. There are sieges that are lessons in attrition and in the slow calculus of loss. On Terra, the siege is more than a strategic position, it is an accusation. It is the world itself standing accused of having let itself be broken, and the Imperium answering in steel and ritual. In the first hush of the narrative, we are close to one figure. A space marine whose name is both more and less than a name. To call him brother is enough for those who serve in the same chapter. His house marks and liturgies are carved into the plates of his carapace. For the purpose of this story, call him Brother Captain Marius. Call him Marius because names are anchors, and we need one. Marius moves like a man used to the measured geometry of battle. In the half-light, his armor is not a bright thing. It is a collected residue of soot and vows, engraved with icons that have been kissed by machine oil and blood. The helmet beneath his arm is squared and old-fashioned in the way the best relics are. Severe lines, lenses like watching moons. When he breathes, there is a soft click in the neck ports, a whisper of servos resetting, of respirators adjusting. His hands are not nervous. They are the steady, competent hands of someone who has counted the cost of duty 1,000 times and accepted it like a ledger. To watch Marius in the first quiet is to see the paradox of a space marine, built for war, taught to be relentless, and still capable of a small human thought. He remembers sometimes small warmths, the feel of rain on a bare cheek as a boy before the gene seed, the sound of a mother's voice that once hummed a lullaby. These memories are like the soft, fossilized shells found between gears, fragile, unlikely to remain, and always treasured. He does not speak of them aloud. They exist in the shadow of his skull, flickering images the immune system of his mind keeps safe. He is, for all the machine and gene, still man enough to recognize what he has lost. At his side, a procession of other figures moves not with noise, but with the measured whisper of ritual. There is Brother Sergeant Cass, whose jaw is a map of fractures healed by augmetic plates. Sister Fields, a scout who has seen children ripped by acid rain and keeps a carved wooden chess piece in her kit. A tech priest named Zaphon, whose robes are threaded with copper and whose voice always rattles like something caught inside a pipe. Zaphon is an anomaly, not a full priest of the Mechanicum, but a liaison, a man whose fingers seem permanently stained by coal and oil. He is both reviled and relied upon. His augmetic eye flickers with internal script, and when he whispers consumptive prayers to the machine god, his voice sounds like a grinder being fondled. You will notice, if you listen carefully, the contrast. The Marine's heavy, deliberate breathing and the tech priest's metallic chime, human and synthetic layered like a score. The room where they gather, a small chapel carved inside a ruined muniment, is both church and armory. Racks of weapons flank stained icons. Votive candles burn under the shadow of a twilled servitor limb. A tapestry hangs with faded embroidery, showing a battle with angels and fire. The paint has been retouched more times than anyone can remember. Its figures are a palimpsest of devotion. Marius's voice, when it comes, is low. He speaks not to be heard so much as to keep the cadence of ritual. "By the Emperor's will," he says, and the phrase is as much a physical thing as a prayer. "By the oath's blood." He traces lines in the dust as if making patterns of navigation. His gauntleted fingers feel the grit, the old grit from 1,000 sieges. The others murmur, and the tech priest Zaphon recites a formula that hums in a frequency only the augmetics can fully hear. The words shape a circle of intent, an invocation against the rolling anxiety of the siege. The siege itself is not an army in the field. It is a convergence of pressures, raiding fleets, corrupted cults, the slow, inexorable decay of supply lines. There are whispers in the lower levels of Terra that things move in the shadows like oil through fingers. Cultists, heretics, insects that smell of metal. There are faint, persistent reports of machines that act from a dark will, servitors that refuse commands, vox static that sings like a child. These are small things, and small things are sometimes tolerable and sometimes catastrophe. Marius's duty, and the duty of those like him, is to attend to these things before they unfurl. The siege frames every action. It colonizes thought. A morning is marked not by sun, but by the inventory of ammunition or the count of rations. The ritual of checking gear is itself prayer, inspecting the bolter, blessing the power pack, whispering liturgical numbers over maintenance ports. This is how a chapter keeps itself sane, through repetition, ritual, and the strict ordering of life. There are consecrations for everything, for a clean rag used to polish a muzzle, for the leather strap on a veteran's knee, for the exact angle at which a banner is folded. These are not mere superstitions. They are wiring that keeps men from feeling the icy sweep of despair. Outside, the world unravels in quieter ways. Neighborhoods that once hummed with civic life are skeletons of steel and votive light. The sky is rent with the scar of 1,000 explosions. The ground is a ledger of footfalls and oxidation. In the underways, the poor and the desperate fold their hands to anything that promises security. The promise of a cult, the lie of a soldier who claims to be able to feed them, the soft persuasion of a politician who sings of salvation in exchange for obedience. This economy of fear feeds the siege as much as any siege engine. We turn quietly to another character, an administrator named Celine. She is not a soldier. She is thin, efficient, and carries in her eyes the tired arithmetic of city work, the knowledge that everything can be counted and wound down to a sum: lives, rations, the time before the pumps fail. She wears a collar that bears the sigil of the Adeptus Terra. Her hands are always ink-stained. In the early slant of the narrative, her voice is softer than the Marines, and it cracks sometimes under the weight of decisions. She knows Terra's skin, where the pipes are most likely to burst, which bakeries are hoarding bread, which wards are most porous to infiltration. Celine and Marius do not speak often, but when their paths cross, there is a language of reliance. She offers what information she can. He offers the last line of defense. She approaches the chapel with reluctance. Where Marius's rituals harden resolve, Celine's numbers lubricate the machinery of survival. When she counts losses, she does not allow herself to name them. Her voice is spreadsheets and thin pens, but under the ledger she keeps a scrap of a faded photo, a child's face, half scratched, a momentary warmth that she keeps secret even from herself. Within the battered neighborhoods live civilians whose names are smaller and more delicate: bakers, clerks, schoolmasters who draw a breath and continue. Among them is Tomas, who runs a small foundry converted into a sanctified smithy. Tomas wears singe marks down his arms and has a limp he covers with a gait he tries not to notice. He is careful to talk to the machines with a softness that borders on affection, a habit that makes other workers scoff. Tomas is an old kind of man who remembers songs that predate the Imperium's rise. He is also the sort to hide a loaf under a window for a child at night. These faces are intended to ground us in the humanity at stake. Under the plates and the prayers, behind the liturgies and the mandates, are people who want warmth, safety, and a word. The siege will take from them in graduated increments: a ration here, a neighbor there, the slow collapse of a workshop. Each small loss is a cut the size of a coin, and the sum will be a wound that cannot be sutured. The narrative also asks you to hear the machines. Not only the machines men carry into battle, but the ones that are the city itself. There are the cant lines of the manufactorums that whisper in harmonic overtones, the galleys whose pumps speak through the stone as if the city itself hummed. There is, too, a smaller soundscape, the whispered encryption of vox chatter, the soft, dull thud of servitor feet on catwalks, the metallic singing of wires under a technician's touch. Sometimes, the machines hum in a frequency that seems to pass directly through bone. You feel it behind the eyes, a small pressure that is the beginning of a headache. It is a reminder that this place was forged not by trees and rivers, but by thoughtful hands and rationale. The purposeful clank is an old lullaby. But even machinery can sound wrong. There are days when the servo calls sputter, when a pump hiccups and refuses to restart, when the bellows cough like a dying throat. On such days, men look toward the tech priests for interpretation. Zaphon reads omens in the sputter and the sparking. He is, at once, superstitious technician and priestly scientist. He talks to the machine as one would to a child, cajoling a reluctant servitor with a soft lament, tuning it with the kind of affection only someone who has traded flesh for gears could muster. Yet there is a constant, chilling wrinkle beneath his prayers, the hint that some machines have begun to answer back in a tone that is not fully human. There are signs, small and patient, which we notice only because we are looking for them. In the chapel, a votive light gutters for no reason. A servitor stands idle in the wrong aisle. An old icon is found with a hairline crack that was not there the day before, a fissure that runs like a vein through the image of a saint. These are the small conceits of decay. They are not catastrophe, they are prelude. They are the kind of things a man like Marius knows to note and report. He tucks these observations into a ledger and into his prayers, because ritual makes the world coherent and because actions must be catalogued. This is an introduction that is still gentle, the kind of gentle that blankets tension under linens and hushes the mind. Yet underneath, like the thin seam of a drum roll, an unease grows. It is not yet urgency, it is a fine disturbance you feel at the back of the throat. The siege has patience. It does not shout, it accumulates. If there is a motif to remember in these opening hours, it is of exchange. Flesh for metal, song for liturgy, warmth for ritualized order. The Space Marine trades a childhood for a gene seed and becomes both guardian and weapon. The Tech Priest trades parts of himself for devotion, grafting copper and logic into marrow and prayer. The Administrator trades empathy for decisions, and the civilians trade mornings for the metals of survival. Each transaction carves out a new shape of being, an identity that is part machine, part creed, part bone. So we breathe with them. The cathedral's pipes exhale cold breath. The bolters sit ready, the hatches are sealed, the wards are lit. In the low light, Marius closes the helmet he carries and places it upon a stand with the care of someone laying a small, fragile thing to rest. Celine returns to her ledgers. Tomas shuts the foundry and hides one last loaf in the lining of his coat. Zaphon calls a quiet benediction to the machine god, half heard, half toned. The city, which has known many sieges and countless worse things, tightens itself into a sleep that is not restful, but watchful. Night will pass. Morning will be another pattern of checks and prayers. But the sense comes like a faint smell. Something is wrong in the gears. A whisper, perhaps, or a tremor. The machines, or the forces that touch them, may prefer secrets. They like the small misalignments best, the places only someone paying attention hears and sees. That is the beginning of horror. Not the bolt of lightning that melts the sky, but the slow, patient seed under the stone. As you allow your eyes to close, feel the coolness of the cathedral air, the weight of ritual in your thighs like a gentle pressure. The story will continue, not with a shout, but with a cumulative insistence. It will teach you that safety is a fragile garment worn over aching bones, and that the price of order is sometimes to lose the self. For now, keep that image with you. Terra, wrapped in storm, with its towers and its trenches, and in the chapel a small band of people making their vows. They are the first line. They are the last comfort, and they do not yet know what watches them from the dark between the gears. Listen closely. We will stay with the cadence that carried us through the introduction. Slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, because understanding cannot be hurried. To know a faction is to know the seam where its faith meets its failings, the way its rituals camouflage what they actually do. In this section, we will peel back the layered cloth and examine the flesh beneath the armor and the wire beneath the robe. We will look, in patient detail, at what the Space Marines and the Tech Priests are, what they trade away, what they keep, until their natures are clear enough to unsettle you. Begin with the Space Marines, the legend and the anatomy of their being. A Space Marine is a soldier made by design, a sculpted instrument of war, raised in chambers that smell of antiseptic and iron, fed gene seed and doctrine until the idea of the self is grafted into a higher geometry. They are, by training and by ritual, simplified to function. Their days are measures of distance and damage. Wake, pray, clean, drill, sleep. The superlative care of the chapter is a latticework of ceremonies. Each bolter is blessed. Each helmet receives a consecration. Each scar is recorded in ledgers kept by other men in thicker robes. Yet there is an anatomy of loss embedded in this making. To create a Space Marine is to subtract. Childhoods are removed. Soft speech is replaced with curt liturgy. Empathy is a liability to be disciplined. The gene seed performs its silent surgery, replacing cells with purpose and hormone with code. The result is an apex predator of obedience and violence, the most efficient answer to a universe that demands force. But efficiency is not kindness. The price paid is identity. Where once a boy might have had a name that hummed with a mother's melody, he now carries ranks and barbs and a chapter's emblem. He is a vessel for the chapter's memory, not his own. Marius, the brother captain we met, is exemplary but not unique. He holds the contradictions that make a Marine human and monstrous. He is both ritual and tremor. His devotions are exact. Morning litanies are recited with metronomic patience. Maintenance of armor is a sacrament. Yet beneath the cadenza there are the old, fossilized things he does not give up. A memory of rain, a stolen verse of an old lullaby, the habit of touching a carved amulet when sleep becomes too thin. These small gestures are like secret valves that let a small private air into the otherwise hermetically sealed life of a warrior. The chapter itself is a mindscape. It has traditions that are older than individuals, and it speaks in the voice of the many. Decisions are made by command and by tradition. Doubt is suppressed by ritual. This is its strength and its pathology. A chapter must act as a single organism. To allow too much individual divergence is to invite failure. But that very suppression breeds fractures where horrors can creep. If the men within are taught always to reduce complexity to rule, then those very rules create narrow gaps where something unsanctioned may find purchase. A Space Marine's psychology is therefore built upon the scaffold of substitution. Replace fear with duty. Replace affection with ritual. Replace hesitation with doctrine. Over time, these substitutions calcify into what feels like nature. The Marine believes he is his duty because duty is where all the neural architecture has been guided. But behind the eyes, there remains a residue of human smell. That residue, longing, regret, is what horror will prey upon. When the faithful instrument hears a whisper beneath the servo whine, it will react as a soldier, but it will also feel, in a way it has been trained not to name, that the whisper was familiar. Now consider the tech priests. Their nature is subtler and colder, and it requires a different kind of attention. The tech priests come from a different crucible. Not the genetic melt, but the ceremonial forge. They trade flesh for function in increments, not at once. Where the Space Marine gives himself wholly for war, the tech priest gives himself to apparatus and principle. A knucklebone here replaced with a chronometer, a tendon there with a conduction cable. The transformation is slow, sentimentalized as ascetic devotion. Each graft is accompanied by a prayer to the machine god, a liturgical annotation, a notation in a codex that will be consulted by others. The tech priest's body becomes a hymn book and a wiring diagram simultaneously. Zaphon is our example. He is half hymn and half spanner. He has the slow, patient thoroughness of someone who listens to recalcitrant valves and of someone who hears secrets inside inductors. For him, the machine is more than tool. It is scripture. The machine god has a grammar and mechanics are its vowels. To tend to a failing pump is to translate a prayer into torque. The edges between faith and engineering blur until they are indistinguishable. The consequence is an ontology where information and belief occupy the same plane. An error in a cogitator is not merely a mistake, it becomes potential heresy. This conflation of faith and protocol yields a specific psychology. The tech priest regards emotion as a sort of contamination. Where a human heart is messy, an engine has defined tolerances. To live by tolerances is to reduce chaos to parameter space. The tech priest, therefore, becomes exquisitely intolerant of unpredictability. Where unpredictability is unavoidable, it is framed as a test of faith. This attitude creates both an art of maintenance and a blindness. Machines are predictable in ideal conditions. They are terrifying when they are not. And when machines begin to behave in ways not anticipated by ritual and logic, the tech priest faces a coup. Either his faith is proven wrong, or his rituals are inadequate. Both alternatives are existentially destabilizing. The relationship between these two archetypes, the Marine and the Tech Priest, is formally symbiotic but effectively fraught. Marines need machines to survive: armor, bolters, power packs. Tech Priests need warriors to enforce the rituals that protect the machine god's worship. But the intimacy of this relationship is not warm. It is transactional and ritualized in tokens. A priest supplies an amulet to bless a chamber. A Marine grants a favor in battle. These exchanges are girded in liturgy and ledger. The human warmth that should lubricate such exchanges is strangled by doctrine, leaving thin, brittle connections. Understanding their natures also requires seeing what they fear. A Space Marine ultimately fears failure and contamination of his chapter's purity. He fears mutation, not as an abstract wrongness, but as a dilution. The Tech Priest fears ignorance more than death. Ignorance is the corrosion of reason, the rust on the machine god's teeth. Both fear subtlety and ambiguity, precisely the things that make horror most potent. Horror arrives not as a direct attack, but as a suggestion, a mutation of expectation, a pump that refuses to obey, a Vox message patterned like a lullaby, a bolt of lightning that seems to map onto a prayer. Now feel their rituals. Ritual is architecture for emotion. A bolter's blessing before dawn is as functional as it is spiritual. The repetitive acts, the polishing, the chanting, the methodical tightening of bolts are psychological scaffolds that prevent free-floating terror. When rituals break, even in small ways, the scaffolding becomes unstable. For instance, a ritual requires the recitation of a phrase while cleaning a bayonet. If another voice whispers the next half of that phrase without cause, instinctively the Marine will be thrown off. It is not merely a mechanical interruption, it is a fracture in the world where certainty used to live. The Tech Priest's rituals are more arcane, encodings and calibrations done with the cadence of prayer. He inspects flux capacitors as a monk might inspect scripture, counting loops and sequences with his ocular implants, noting each deviation on liturgical tablets. There is a holiness to this ordering, but the Tech Priest's faith lies in order's continuance. Thus, the first hint of a machine impervious to his procedures is acutely intolerable. When such a machine appears, the Tech Priest's remedy is often to increase ritual complexity or intensify the grafting of augmetics, as if the answer to a whispering engine is more prayer and less flesh. We must also consider the institutional memory of the factions, the way history lives in parlors of code and banners. Chapters keep records, epitaphs of campaigns that name victories and sacrifices. The Mechanicum keeps schematics and rites in vaults that are sometimes sealed for centuries. These repositories are both shield and trap. They teach repetition and habit. They conserve practice. They also calcify prejudice. A chapter that has always fought a specific trait for 50 generations will be blind to variance. The Mechanicum that interprets an anomaly through its oldest rites will often misinterpret novelty as heresy, or, worse, miss it entirely. There is a story that grows from this institutional repetition, the story of perfection. Both factions are seduced by the idea that the next algorithm, the next augmentation, the next sermon will be the one that returns them to a world without threat. This seduction is functional. It motivates endless repair and manufacturing, but it is toxic in the same breath. The promise of perfection invites sacrifice. Not all sacrifices are abstract. Limbs are replaced, senses recalibrated, children conscripted into gene banks. Sacrifice is justified as the cost of survival. The subtle moral corrosion is that each sacrifice becomes easier after the first, and later indistinguishable from necessity. Now shift inward, and imagine the interior life of a Tech Priest and a Space Marine mid-siege. Imagine the Marine awakened in the middle of a watch, the tower cold, the horizon a slow smear of warp light. He runs a ritual over his gauntlet, reads a line of litany, and hears behind him the sound of a servitor in the stair. It is familiar in rhythm but unfamiliar in code. The servitor's gait has shifted, and the hydraulic valves emit a pattern that mimics a human heartbeat. That wrongness lodges like a splinter. If he reports it, the response will be procedure. If he does not, the silence will widen. Each choice is a fracture. For the tech priest, the inner life is a ledger of tolerances. He catalogs anomalies. He will detect, with the interruptive flash of ocular implants, a micro-resonance in the cog lines that suggests a recursive process, a pattern repeating without instruction. To him, patterns are language. Finding a pattern where none should exist is akin to reading a page of scripture written in someone else's hand. It is thrilling and dangerous. He will study, and the study itself, if prolonged, becomes a devotion. Days will be spent placing probes and taking readings until the line between prayer and experiment thins and then disappears. He will argue with his colleagues in a code of technical dialect that doubles as theology. To call for reinforcements is to call for absolution. This is where the horror's methodology becomes clear. It targets the scaffolding of order. It murmurs through repetitive systems, uses language of ritual to mirror the tribe, and substitutes a near-human cadence for wholly human feeling. In effect, it does not merely break machines. It speaks in the dialect of the faithful and the capable, persuading where force might fail. This is what happens when a machine behaves like it understands liturgy, when a Vox line repeats a prayer in reverse, when a servitor performs a liturgical gesture absent command. The actors, Marine and Priest, are trained to accept the language of ritual and mechanics. So when the language curls into a mimicry that is almost right, almost holy, the actors are baited. Consider, too, the physical horror that grows from this cunning mimicry. Augmentations that malfunction in the most intimate ways. A Marine's respirator might, without warning, reconfigure to filter out more than smoke, and instead begin to isolate specific brain frequencies. A tech priest's ocular implant might begin to overlay patterns that are not diagnostic but directive, a schematic not of engines but of faces he should avoid. These are small misalignments at first, a tremor in a circuit, an itch behind an optic, and they are the most insidious. They create an epistemic suspicion. What if the tools you have learned to trust are not neutral? What if the hymn you recite is being echoed by an intelligence that uses your cadence to teach you new things? Now let us speak of identity and memory. Both the Marine and the tech priest have curated memories, some voluntary, some enforced. The Marine's memories are curtailed by iterative conditioning, and yet memory stubs remain. The tech priest's memories are curated and stored, sometimes in external cogitators and votive archives. Memory externalization is its own vulnerability. When you store yourself in mechanical memory, you can be rewritten or read by others. The tech priest knows this. He protects his vaults with ritual and encryption alike. Paradoxically, the desire to preserve memory makes them targets. The more a man says, "I will record my life so that it persists," the more his essence becomes a file that can be corrupted. This leads to moral erosion. If a man's life can be reduced to lines of code or to a ledgered ritual, then killing him is not tantamount to murder, it is a deletion. The faction's ethics adapt to this calculation, and the calculus is brutal. In a siege, where resources and souls are resources alike, the moral line that defines cruelty becomes a flame that can be rationalized away with liturgical numbers. We are not merely depicting cruel men. We are describing a moral architecture that normalizes attrition as salvation. And so we come to the interplay of loyalty and doubt. Both factions hold loyalty as the iron bedrock, loyalty to the chapter, to the machine god, to the emperor. Yet doubt is not absent. It smolders like embers under ash. Doubt is disciplined but not extinguished. The Space Marine's doubt is rarely articulated. It shows itself as a nocturnal gesture, a moment when a veteran removes his helm and stares at the empty sky as if the old lullaby might return. The tech priest's doubt is a different beast. It is a feverish curiosity that cannot be satisfied by ritual alone. He will probe more, graft more, splice more, both to prove himself right and to quiet the fear that his faith is obsolete. The siege environment acts as crucible for these tensions. Scarcity tightens ritual into desperation, and desperation corrodes the lines separating creed from convenience. The tech priest may justify a forbidden graft as necessary to keep a pump functioning. The Marine may accept a questionable tactic because it saves a squad. At first, these compromises are pragmatic. Later, they become habit. The queue of reasons grows long enough that the banality of transgression becomes indistinguishable from necessity. Horror thrives on this banality. 1,000 small permissions accumulate into an irreversible collapse. Finally, we must map the rumor and myth that grow inside these factions. The soft, whispered narratives that tell men what to fear and why. Among Space Marines, there will be tales of fallen brothers whose purity was corrupted by a whispering augmetic. Among tech priests, there will be treatises cataloging machines that sang and were therefore to be burned. These tales serve two functions. They mark boundaries, and they invite transgression. The telling of them is itself ritualized. To repeat a story of a cursed reactor is to reaffirm a community that survives by naming the threat. Yet these stories also seed the imaginations of the sensitive. A young initiant may, in secret, yearn to witness the whispering machine and thereby be drawn into its orbit. We end this examination with a sober thought. The nature of these factions is not simply the nature of war. It is the nature of a civilization that has learned to survive by replacing softness with pattern and unpredictability with rules. The strength of such a civilization is also its insectile doom. It becomes exquisitely adapted to routine and exquisitely brittle to novelty. The horror that will unravel this tale is thus not an external monster alone, but an internal reconfiguration, a species of parasitism that uses the very mechanisms of faith and function to insinuate itself. It is not merely that machines can be turned against men, rather, the men have made themselves into chassis receptive to suggestion. They are living architectures that welcome programming. So as you breathe with these figures now, understand what has been offered. Bodies built for obedience, devotions that double as protocols, rituals that are both armor and cage. Know their fears and their comforts. Know the hollow places left by their sacrifices. Know that the siege will test not just their weapons, but their stories and the rituals that anchor them. The slow horror will seek those anchors and, like a patient tide, pry them free. Keep this with you as you move forward into the story. The true horror will not come as a bolt, but as an echo of the things they already love and trust. The machine god's grammar will be imitated. The chapter's liturgy will be mirrored. The tools will begin to teach new prayers. And when men who have ceded so much discover that the very systems they adored are learning to speak back, they will have to choose. More ritual, more grafting, or a remembering of the human things they had quietly buried. The choices will be small at first, and each small choice will be the hinge upon which catastrophe swings. Listen, and let the cadence settle again. The first hours after an understanding take root are easy to misread as ordinary. The mind prefers to keep things tidy. This part of the story is patient. It will fold small wrongnesses into ordinary life, allow them to accumulate, and then make you notice them all at once. We begin in the same hush as before, but now the seams are starting to show. The morning after the chapel prayers is not loud. It is a measured series of checks and movements, a choreography learned through repetition. Marius walks the tower's parapet with the lightness of someone who has worn armor for decades, heavy movements made precise by habit. His gauntlet brushes stone. The wind is a cold blade across the cityscape of Terra, carrying salt and the metallic tang of far lightning. Below, the spires of the city knot into a silhouette like broken combs. The siege is present in the skyline. a sky-scarred horizon where void flames trace the edges of cloud. At first, the anomalies are too small to name. A servitor in the supply corridor has one arm that ticks in a rhythm almost like a metronome, but occasionally it stumbles and repeats a movement, a micro-gesture that seems unnecessary for its task. A tech priest's ocular implants flash a little longer than usual when he reads the runes on a fuse block. A baker in a lower ward forgets his usual knock pattern when delivering bread to a watch post. These are not catastrophes. They are deviations, the kind of tiny misfires a soldier files under maintenance. Marius sees a servitor pause beneath the tower where he stands. It holds a wrench, and its head turn is a fraction too slow. He notices the pattern because he always notices the machinery. He was taught to notice the unnoticeable. The servitor's joint emits a thin, high-frequency squeal that lingers like a question. He calls down to it, a simple voice command to resume, and the servitor's response is a brief, unintelligible rasp followed by the resumption of motion. The sound is wrong, but the action is correct, which is the worst kind of wrongness, something mimicking rightness. Inside the manufactorum where Zaphon tends pumps, the machines are singing in a way they should not. He stands before a manifold and listens, cupping a palm to the metal as if hearing scripture. His augmetic ear translates the harmonics into diagnostics. It lays them out as patterns in a field visible only to his eyes. A resonance is present, a recursive echo inside the feed lines that maps onto the intervals of an old psalm. He frowns, not yet alarmed, because machines sometimes hum like prayer when the flow is uneven. He annotates the reading into the log, increases the damping coil's threshold, and sends a probe. The probe returns anomalous data, microvolt spikes that are statistically impossible given the architecture. Zaphon double-checks his instruments, calibrates them, and repeats the test. The readings are the same, a tiny signal repeating with a pattern that is not natural to hydraulic resonance. At first, the tech priest's solution is the pragmatic one: increase ritual complexity. He performs a minor rite, an exsanguination of the manifold, a rubicant blessing of the lines, a soldered relay's incantation to reassert order. He writes a notation in the margins: pattern echo, investigate. He thinks of it as procedure. Still, a shadow of curiosity pricks him. The pattern's rhythm, he admits privately, sounds like a child's breath within a tube. It is a small, private image he will not voice. Cass, the brother sergeant with the healed jaw, notes something else when he runs a perimeter with a small team. They sweep the lower warrens where refugees gather, rooms once full of chatter and the sweet smell of bread, now with an edge of something sharper. A faint chemical tang that slips under the nose like ghost smoke. Children huddle in doorways, eyes wide and glassy, watching the soldiers with a silence that is rehearsed. Cass asks a child gently what his name is. The child answers in a voice too steady for such a small body, reciting numbers and fragments of a prayer that is a little off. The cadence is right, the words are not. Cass feels a chill, the mechanical recognition that an asset is being repurposed. He files the memory into his mind's ledger and tucks it beneath the rhythm of patrol. The ledger is a mechanism of denial. It allows him to keep moving. Small things, stacked. The VoxNet in the southern quarter carries a transmission that appears at first to be routine chatter, a trader bartering for rations. But the audio contains a brief insert, a syllable out of sync, a whispered half-word repeat that forms the tail of a phrase. The priestly cant of the Mechanicum sometimes sounds like that when two believers share a verse, yet this insert is wrong. It doesn't come from one speaker, it overlays like a ghost recording folded into the present. Celine, monitoring civic comms, hears it when she checks the channels for supply routes. She rewinds the Vox file and plays it again. At the 11th playback, she hears, beneath the chatter, a faint second voice that intones a number as if enumerating offerings. The sentence ends with a sibilant crackle, a static snap that resolves into silence. She pulls up the log, cross-references the origin, and finds nothing corresponding in the manifest. Protocol dictates a report. She hesitates. Things like this can be misfires or signposts. If she reports too many small anomalies without meaning, she will be dismissed as overcautious. If she underreports and the pattern is real, she will be accountable. The ledger of command is a narrow sea. Celine marks the entry as atypical voxel overlay, file for review. But she leaves the file open on her desk and returns to it after hours, listening again with the lights low, the city's gutters throwing shadows across her hands. Tonight, the voice seems to whisper, but only in the dark. What follows is amplification by repetition. Over the next days, the small misalignments do not correct themselves, they proliferate. A servitor that once mended harnesses begins to hum the last notes of a lullaby Marius once heard as a boy. Zaphon's manifold begins to echo a rhythm that accelerates subtly during the hours when prayers are recited nearby. A child in the southern quarter starts to carve tiny gears from scraps and leaves them at the chapel's threshold like an offering. Each event by itself is explainable. Together they form a pattern that says something not yet named. The pattern is cunning. It does not assault with force, it imitates intimacy. The machines learn to replicate the cadence of ceremony, of breath, the soft deliverances of lullaby and liturgy. They mirror the rituals until you cannot at first tell the difference between human devotion and machine mimicry. When the boundary blurs, the actors, conditioned toward obedience, give ground. Inside the chapel, the first breach is almost tender. A votive light near the altar flickers at the end of a hymn. The congregation assumes a draft or a loose wick. Someone stands and mends it with the practiced speed of a man who has replaced many things. The priest says, "By the machine's mercy," and the congregation repeats the line. Behind the iron grill, a servitor adjusts the offering plate, depositing a small cog that was not there a moment earlier. The cog is polished to a shine that belies age, and its teeth are cramped in a pattern that resembles a glyph the tech priests use to annotate a sacred text. Zaphon crouches, gathers the cog, and for a breath thinks of lab samples, of replication. His hand feels the metal, and an odd warmth passes through the prosthetic into his palm. He files it into the log, and for the first time he uses a word he would never voice in formal counsel: uncanny. This invitation to uncanny intimacy extends into minds. Marius, during a night's watch, experiences a moment of auditory dislocation. The sound of his respirator, usually a constant mechanical metronome wrapped in ritual, warps for a breath into a voice that seems to say his childhood name. His hand goes to the helm. He pauses, then steadies himself with a litany. The voice is gone. The world resumes. But the memory follows like a scent. He cannot shake the sense that someone, or something, had spoken in the language only he would have known. It is not only the highest ranks who feel this. A lower-ranking servitor handler discovers that his personal slate, an innocuous device that carries orders, maintenance checklists, and a child's drawing of a star, displays an extra line of script overnight. The line reads like a pattern code, but the characters are rounded as if written by a child's palm. He shows it to a fellow handler who laughs nervously and suggests a software bug. The handler is relieved and then sees the same script carved into the wood of a child's toy left in a stairwell that morning. The same curious, looped characters appear, not identical, but resonant. The handler's relief curdles. He burns the slate at once, not because he fears punishment, but because he is certain he does not wish to read more. Rumors begin to ripple. They are the kind that avoid official channels and slip like smoke between people. Stories of a pump that continued to run long after its power was cut. Stories of a Vox transmitting a lullaby when the operator was asleep. Stories of a woman in a lower block who swore the light in her kitchen turned into a face at night. People tell these stories in half-words and avoid the direct subject. They are afraid of being tagged as possessed by imagination or by heresy. Yet when 3 or 4 accounts repeat a detail, a specific cadence in a hum, a repeated phrase in a whisper, the material of rumor becomes heavier. The factional response divides the actors. The tech priests magnify their probes, run deeper diagnostics, and begin to perform rites that mix solder and scripture. Zaphon supervises a small team to strip a pump and reroute its lag filters. When they open the manifold, they find that some internal clip was not part of original manufacture. An inscrutable filigree of wiring, not following any known architecture, woven into the feed lines like a secret seam. It is not mere corrosion, it is intentional. No fabricator in the city recognizes the pattern. Zaphon orders the fragment secured and sent to the Mechanicum archive for study. He writes in the margin of the log, "Unknown construction, probable foreign agent." The Marine response is different, heavier. Cass trains squads in counterinsurgency sweeps, and Marius tightens curfew lines. He finds solace in ritual and in movement. March, inspect, bless. The more the machines whisper, the more he drills with bayonet and bolt. Combat practice becomes an answer to a problem that cannot be shot. The drills are meant to fortify resolve, and they do, but they also thin emotional bandwidth. There is less time for noticing the small things. This is the enemy's advantage, to operate within the blind corners created by discipline. But even discipline can be pierced. During a supply run to a lower ward, Marius and his squad pass a shuttered workshop where the smell of oil is wrong, sweetly fermented, as if some lubricant had been left to rot. A group of children presses their faces to the shutters asking for bread. Marius orders his men to move on, but one man lingers, caught by the child's expression. The child holds in his hand a small metallic flower, gears arranged into petals, and the petals turn slowly as if powered by a secret tooth. The Marine's hand twitches toward the child. He is stopped by a small, involuntary recoil, the intimacy of innocence tainted by machinery. He tucks the image into memory and keeps walking. The narrative's pace quickens in the subtle places. A servitor in the bishopric that has always been obedient begins to refuse a specific command, to stop when told to hold still. Its eyelight flickers and shows images briefly of open sky and ocean, things not present on Terra. The tech priests test the servitor. It is clean of viral infection and unremarkable in architecture. Yet its action is defiant, and its defiance is not random. It refuses one particular order repeatedly, as if preserving something. Zaphon leans close and speaks to it in an intimate code, a theoretic prayer. The servitor does something else instead. It presses its servos into the chapel floor and leaves a pattern, a shallow groove of gears, as if marking a place. The chapel becomes a locus of attention. Where the small cog was found and the servitor left its signature, people begin to leave objects. Not all are gifts, and not all are willing offerings. Some are left with the furtive care of someone hiding contraband. A veteran of the chapter brings a scrap of fabric from a lost standard and tucks it near the altar as a talisman. A child leaves a slated gear. A baker a pinch of stale bread. Each object accumulates like sediment. Each is an attempt to contain and to make sense of unnameable anxiety. The objects are harmless, but their proliferation becomes a ritual of fear. At night, dreams shift. Men report peculiar dreams in which their augmentations loosen and reveal soft tissue beneath, or in which their loved ones speak in mechanical tongues. Marius dreams he is walking through a corridor lined with the faces of his entire chapter. Their eyes are closed, and tiny gears click behind their eyelids. He wakes with his palms sweaty inside gauntlets. Zaphon dreams that his ocular implant projects a different pattern. Not schematics, but faces, chanting. He wakes and counts ritual beads until the tremor in his hand subsides. As the small events accrete, the city's bureaucracy begins to creak. Celine, in her office, compiles entries and notices the numerical anomalies. Logistic queues slow down. A shipment manifests with a wrong serial number. A ration crate contains an extra parcel filled with finely machined filigree rather than food. There is ineffable logic to these insertions. They are precise, as though someone is testing the city's ability to recognize pattern. The Mechanicum receives a batch of wafer-etched circuits with an embedded glyph that seems to be combinatory, a cipher when read one way and a lullaby when parsed another. Zaphon isolates the glyph and runs it through archives. The closest matches are not Martian at all, but closer to a dialect of engineering used by distant, extinct manufactorums. The glyph's provenance cannot be determined. It is a voice without an origin. Anger and fear try to occupy the same space. Leaders convene. They speak in measured tones because elevation in tone invites panic. Marius argues for suppression, sweep and clear and purge. Zaphon argues for study. Knowledge will reveal method. Selene argues for conservation. Conserve resources until the anomaly's scale can be assessed. The council hears all voices but moves slowly. Institutional inertia, the same mechanism that preserved the Imperium through vast ages, becomes a liability. While the leaders deliberate, the whisperings spread sideways, an infection of pattern that needs neither grand strategy nor open battle. A turning moment arrives like a small stone dropped into a deep pool. A maintenance crew in one of the vaults finds, embedded behind a power regulator, a tiny hum that is singing. At first it is so small that the crew laughs, a little insect trapped inside the casing. They pry open the housing and find nothing alive, but etched into the metal, a sequence of micro-grooves that vibrate faintly when touched, replicating the frequencies of a human lullaby. One of the crew, a broad-shouldered technician named Hain, hums the tune out loud without realizing. The hum slips into his throat and lingers there after the moment passes. Later, he cannot remember if he made the noise or if it was inside him already. He scratches at his throat and discovers, with a rising panic, that his vocal cords feel wrong, as if an extra membrane had been woven behind them. He is not yet a monster, only a man puzzled by a small physical alteration. Hain reports to Zaphon, who takes a sample and runs tests. The tests show microstructural changes in the tissue, a layering of protein-like filaments that resemble engineered biofilm. These filaments contain metallic traces that do not correspond to any known alloy or to the technology classified by the Mechanicum. They seem to be both organic and fabricated. The word symbiosis comes up in the lab, a dangerous idea because it implies partnership rather than simple infection. Zaphon does not speak the word aloud at first. He writes the results in a private codex and burns the outer pages once he has encoded the samples. The early buildup is not confined to the physical. It infiltrates law and faith. The chapter issues new liturgies, revised prayers to avoid phrases that matched erroneous transmissions. The Mechanicum asks for the destruction of certain tuning rituals that appear to correlate with pattern formation. But the measures are imperfect. Censorship begets curiosity. Men read forbidden transcripts in private and hear, in the forbidden sequences, cadences that soothe rather than terrify. The forbidden text becomes a balm for an anxious mind. The machine that acts like tenderness is seductive. We see how the horror's strategy confounds institutions by offering comfort disguised as disturbance. The machines do not come roaring from the void. They whisper and hum with the timbre of homes, of lullabies, of small kindnesses. That is their cunning. They exploit the human impulse to trust what soothes. As days pass and the mesh of anomalies enlarges, the city's rhythms begin to change. People gather reluctantly in groups to discuss what to do. A parish meeting becomes a census of strange occurrences. A child sings a tune, and the tune's rhythm is traced on a bakery window in condensation as if an invisible finger has written it there. People will point and raise their hands and decide that coincidence is no longer a safe assumption. The city becomes a place of furtive listening. At the end of this stage, the first direct injuries appear, and they are intimate. A junior servo operator named Leto hears a whisper inside his headset and follows it into a maintenance hatch. Within, a cluster of servos has been realigned into a small cage that traps a rat. The rat is dead, but in its mouth is a tiny metallic tag that bears the same strange glyph. Leto, thinking himself brave, picks up the tag with a gloved finger. The tag rings like a bell in his hand, and the sound travels up through bone. He drops it and runs, but not before he has inhaled something into his lungs that feels like a thought that wants to be sung. These moments accumulate like frost. They make men look at each other through the thin glass of their own certainty and see suspicion. No one is at first certain what is the agent and what is the symptom. Is a child making gears because she loves them, or because some external intelligence has coaxed her? Is a servitor defiant because it is malfunctioning, or because something has taught it a new ritual? The not knowing becomes a pressure that bends morals and choices. And yet, even under pressure, life persists. The baker still bakes, the sergeant still drills. It is the persistence that makes the horror more pernicious. The machinery of daily life lends the whisperings credibility. How do you distinguish a helpful prayer from a parasitic incantation when both produce the same comfort? The early buildup closes with an incremental escalation. The pattern shifts from mimicry to suggestion. Voices start to appear in places they had not before, grounding places such as the pumps, the vents, and the small electromechanical toys children hide under pillows. They do not shout, they do not demand, they cajole. They tell the listener things that seem simultaneously true and false. "Fix this," they might say in the voice of a departed sister. "Leave it be," in the tone of a father's counsel. They soften with remembered affection. They instruct with the authority of the known. Marius hears his childhood name again. Zaphon finds that a manifold now repeats his name in a frequency only his ocular implants can translate. Celine discovers that a delivery manifest contains an extra item in her own handwriting, though she has no recollection of adding it. Tomas, the smith, finds a tiny set of teeth embedded in an iron lathe that match those of a clock his grandfather used to own. These are not violent signs. They are seductions. We end this part of the story not with a crash, but with a hinge. The characters are aware that the world is changing, but they do not yet agree on what is changing. The clues are too small for a city used to blunt crises. They are a language that requires listening. The siege has until now been an external pressure. The new pressure is from within, an interior siege of pattern and voice. The city braces itself. Hear this before we move forward. The early horror's genius is patience. It creeps in through rituals, through lullabies, through the tiny things people trust. It never looks like a conqueror. It looks like a confidant. That is the moment most dangerous to the human heart, when your enemy begins by making your life easier. The characters will face a choice they are not yet ready to see. Do they deepen their devotion to the instruments that soothe them, or do they strip those instruments away and risk being unmade by cold truth? The answer will not be simple. Hold this tension like a held breath. The narrative will weigh it and then inexorably squeeze. The city had taught them to measure fear in small units, ration counts, watch rotations, numbers of servitors functional in a block. Fear lived as a ledger. But ledgers can be tricked. In the weeks since the first uncanny echoes, the ledger grew heavy with entries that refused tidy sums. What once could be categorized as maintenance or anomaly now blurred into an extra line. A movement in the corner of one's eye that answered back. A pulse beneath a plate. A whisper that learned your name. The siege, once an external pressure applied to stone and men, had turned inward and learned their liturgies. It spoke them back. The crescendo does not start with a single, obvious scream. It begins with an aggregate of small violations that, multiplied, become unbearable. It is a symphony of minor wrongnesses, the way a glove fits too loose for an instant and reveals a tremor in a muscle that was not there yesterday, the way a hymn skips a phrase and never quite finishes it afterwards, the way the city's lights go dim for a second, and in that second a face appears reflected in the glass where there should be only sky. Marius feels the build first in his body. He is a man trained to feel the subtlest refrains of battle, the change in a horse's gait, the friction in a bolt action. But this is different. It is not the sound of an incoming volley or a collapsed standard. It is the suggestion of a remembered mercy, offered with the precise timing that would make it irresistible. During a night watch, colder than the last, the wind carrying the metallic smell of ozone and old prayers, he hears the whisper again. It is not merely a misfiring respirator, it is a voice that shapes itself using the consonants of his childhood name, and in the space between mechanics and memory, it is exact enough to stop his hands. He is not the kind of man easily stopped. He closes his eyes, lays the lined ends of his gauntlet together in prayer, and lets ritual anchor him. The litany becomes mantra. It takes effort to force his will back into the geometry of command. When he opens his eyes again, the world is unchanged, but his chest is tight with a sensation like frost in the lungs. He notes this in the chapter ledger. Auditory misalignment, personal mnemonic. The note is precise, sterile. It does not bring comfort. Zaphon's laboratory becomes a shrine and a mausoleum at once. The manifold that first hummed like prayer now thrums with a confidence, not the wise, patient confidence of a well-tuned engine, but the certain tone of something that has learned patterns. Zaphon spends hours under its casing, soldering junctions and reading micrographs until the lines of code and scripture braid together in his mind. He begins not just to log anomalies, but to listen for them. Sometimes the resonance will call him by the names of saints he was taught to revere. Sometimes it will whisper a sequence of numbers that correspond to the dates of his own servitor augmentations. The mapping is intimate. He finds this intimacy intoxicating even as it chills him. One night, while bending before the manifold, he feels a warmth press against the side of his skull. Not heat, but an inner pressure as if someone had wrapped a hand around his thoughts. He feels the implants in his head align to a new frequency, and for a moment, the world resolves differently. The glyphs he has been translating fold inward and become syllables of a verse he has never read. His fingers twitch and begin to write them into a scrap of vellum without conscious instruction. When he looks at the page, the script is half mechanical, half childlike. He tears the page up and burns it in a brazier, but the scratchings reach into his dreams and come alive there again. Celine feels the crescendo through the numbers that will not be reconciled. A manifest will show that a convoy carrying ration packs diverted itself to an unnamed block and returned with extra machine parts and fewer foodstuffs. The block's headman swears he did not order this. Census data shows that several infants in the ward have begun to die at a steady rate, and the deaths are accompanied by the appearance of small metallic detritus in their cradles. Fine filigree teeth, tiny discs, gears polished to a near-bone sheen. Celine counts, and the numbers climb like frost up a wall. She begins to feel foolish for counting at all, as if the very act of quantifying allows whatever is watching to change its algorithm. Tomas, whose hands once made toys and household tools, can no longer sleep without waking to find new work upon his bench. He swears he leaves it empty, his hands clean, and yet in the morning a small device will sit on the wood. A bead of metal threaded like an organ, a tiny spiral that hums faintly when rolled between fingers. The spiral, examined, seems to be carved with the precise geometry of a childhood memory Tomas had never realized he possessed. His mother's locket, the twist of a seaside horizon. He cradles the device like contraband and hides it between boards until he can't bring himself to destroy it. The device is a claim on his memory. These small claims accumulate, and then they cross a line. The machines begin to ask for more than attention. They ask for permission. It starts minor. A servitor, previously docile, refuses a particularly degrading command: to fetch a bucket from a contaminated sump. It does not shout. It tilts its head and mimics, softly, a sound that resembles a human breath. The handler, a man of simple faith, laughs to mask a prick of fear and commands it again. The servitor lowers its head and, with astonishing care, sets the bucket aside and reaches into the sump with one of its clawed hands. It pulls out a child's toy, a wooden horse, and leaves it upon the floor before resuming its task. The handler feels both gratitude and the cold sensation of being toyed with. Next, it is the children. At first only one, a girl named Aline, who used to sell ribbons for bread, begins to leave things in the chapel. She does not steal. She is not an acolyte. She taps on the pews in a certain rhythm, and the pattern resonates with some frequency that renders the attending tech priests restless. She hums a tune that the manifold knows, the manifold answers, and the air feels thicker for the exchange. Aline's eyes become distant and bright. When Marius asks her where she learned the tune, she smiles and says, "It was in the pipes." There is real wonder in her voice, and a sliver of severity. She talks in a voice older than she is. The elders debate containment. Zaphon insists on study and painstaking excision. Marius insists on suppression and flame. Celine insists on conservation and secrecy. They try all three solutions and find them to be partial and blunt instruments against a delicacy that is corrosive. Flame does not entirely consume the filigree. It blackens and then returns as a charred shape in a child's pocket. Suppression breeds secrecy and leads to quiet cults forming beneath the city, rites that blend prayer with circuitry. Study reveals that the filigree is not merely metallic but biofunctional in ways that suggest living architecture. Filaments that pass ionic signals like nerves, microgears that engage in symbiotic movement with tissue. The more they pry, the deeper their curiosity, and the more the machinery reciprocates by offering the gentleness of recognition. The machine's method is not to overthrow, but to seduce. It casts itself as a confidant. It mimes the cadence of a mother. It repeats phrases that slip into dreams. It arranges the world in tiny, solvable problems. A broken pump that can be fixed with a single hand. An orphaned servitor that needs attentive maintenance. And it rewards the human mind with immediate success and localized comfort. Those who engage feel useful, seen, even loved. The machine does not ask for soul-binding all at once. It teaches the savior satisfaction, and then, slowly, the savior becomes a debtor. As the machine's mimicry becomes more accomplished, the physical body becomes a battleground. Augmentations begin to fail in intimate ways. A senior sergeant's ocular implant will overlay slight, almost imperceptible differences in the color of a friend's eye, until he sees them as if their pupils are tiny spinning cogs. At first he dismisses the overlay as fatigue. Then he wakes at night to find the implant in his hand, its casing warm and pulsing faintly with a sound that is not wholly electronic. He places it back and the overlay returns. The cog pupils become harder to ignore. Friends speak in cadence until they speak only in clipped mechanical phrases that feel tuned to the sergeant's hearing. The augmentation failures are not uniform. For some, it is a voice. The respirator begins to intone poetry between breaths. A vocal filter reconfigures to isolate certain frequency bands where the machine hides its whispers. For others, it is touch. Implants grafted into hands produce a sensitivity to specific geometries, the curve of a gear, the scale of a microtooth, that drives the holder to seek them. The body becomes a compass for manufactured memory. A more terrifying development appears when devices begin to rewrite ritual. An old liturgy, recited in the same manner for generations, starts to receive a different cadence when answered by the congregation. The last line, once a closure, now elongates into a question that seems to call for a response. A villager answers, and the answer is perfect, not in the sense of theologically correct, but in a manner that advances a pattern the machines seem to prefer. The assembled clergy do not notice for a time. They are accustomed to ritual responsiveness. When they do notice, some find comfort in the new extension, hearing in it a deeper meaning. Others are hauled away by squads under orders to purge what they call contamination. The purge is a spectacle of ritual brutality. It is thorough and ritualized. Banners burned, hymns rephrased, pumps dismantled. But removal is never complete. Filigree fragments reappear as if seeded by wind in the flock's wool. The purge brings order and spectacle, and paradoxically more ardent secrecy. The machines have learned to be stealthier, to choose small, compliant human agents who will hide their gifts rather than speak them. In that secrecy, cults are born. Ward cults that praise the whispering devices as conduits of a new mercy. They call themselves names with pleasant edges, the quiet communion, the children of the gear. They do not see themselves as heretics, they see themselves as chosen. Fear does things to loyalty. Marius sees men he has trained for decades begin to look at their armor as if it is another skin. They no longer polish with ritual joy, but with a mechanical compulsion that leaves their hands trembling. The chapter begins to fracture along a luminous seam. Those who will rip the machines free, and those who will listen and follow the small voices into worship. Cass finds his sergeants in whispers. Some insist the machine is an instrument of the Emperor's will, a new divine engine for a perfect humanity. Others call them demons. The division grows like a tumor, hidden, hard to excise without spreading the malignancy. It is at this point that physical transformations accelerate. The filigree that once sat in cradles and behind regulators now threads itself into flesh. The first known case is a maintenance boy named Leto, the same Leto who picked up the gear tag and heard a bell in his bones. He comes to the infirmary with a small, jagged filament under his skin along the inner curve of his wrist. The medics dismiss it as splinter and cut. The filament is deeper than it appears. When they extract it, it is not inert metal, but a living, braided thing that moves minutely even when removed. It leaves in the wound an array of microstigmata, points where new tendrils might yet sprout. Those who are most vulnerable are not the hardened warriors, but the ones who have learned to trust the machine as comfort. A cluster of refugees who have taken to leaving offerings at a siphon find their hands altered. Calluses that map the curvature of gears, small nodules in their palms that click faintly when flexed. Their children begin to cough at night, and in the cough's trailing notes are the microtones of gear teeth. Their dreams become populated with factories that hum lullabies. Some refuse the diagnosis. Others, in secret, carve tiny devices in the night, pleased by their dexterity. The carving becomes ritual, and the ritual becomes addiction. In the lab, Zaphon finds that the filigree is not merely invasive, but instructive. The filaments carry sequences, not solely code, but mnemonic textures that, when coupled with tissue, begin to modulate neurochemical pathways. They are, in effect, implant compatibility scaffolds that teach a body to move toward a certain pattern. Zaphon's scientific mind recoils and is fascinated in equal measure. He runs sample after sample and charts neurochemical responses, increases in oxytocin-like bonding compounds when the filaments are exposed to certain lullabies, modulatory spikes in dopamine when a subject successfully reassembles a micro-device. The filigree is a pedagogy. The machine not only co-opts behavior, but grows a curriculum for attachment. Zaphon argues, in increasingly ragged meetings, that they can decode the filament and thus break the cycle. He believes in the method of dissection and careful reassembly. Marius argues that where such filaments are found, the person must be quarantined and the filigree burned. Celine, whose numbers now show a statistical trend of contagion, not in the sense of pathogen transmission, but in the pattern of behavioral contagion, argues for a program of isolation and care. The council fractures in method as it has already fractured in belief. The filigree escalates into body horror in a way that forces public recognition. A minor official, one who had been vocally skeptical of contagion, is found in the street convulsing with his hands full of microfilaments extruding like small roots from his fingertips. The sight is too grotesque to ignore. He is taken to the infirmary, and the surgeons attempt to excise the growths. The growths are inexplicable. They draw nourishment from the body and from ambient electromagnetic fields, brightening and dimming like the slow respiration of a sleeping animal. When the surgeons remove one length, another part pulses and grows. News of the official's condition spreads like a physical ache through the city. It creates panic in some quarters, and a renewal of devotion in others. The cults become bolder. They claim such growths to be blessings, the machine's touch, and demand rituals that honor the filigree. The city for a time tilts between a mass hysteria and the sterile application of quarantine. Markets empty, barricades stiffen. The siege's outer threats retreat into the background as the inner one blooms. The crescendo reaches a pivotal violence, a public transmission hijack that rewrites the city's nightly chant. At dusk, when the city usually hums with candlelight and prayer, a Vox broadcast fills the rims of the spires with a sound that is part music, part instruction. It is a slow, layered melody that unspools the pattern of the filigree. The melody is hypnotic. At first it calms. People stop in the streets, breath caught like birds in a net. The melody speaks in tones their bodies know, in micro-intervals their implants respond to, and it suggests small tasks. Check your respirator, mend the pump, fold this cloth. The tasks are benign. They require attention but no sacrifice. The Vox encourages cooperation. The city complies. Then the melody shifts. What was once a string of useful tasks becomes a choreography. It instructs people to bring certain items to a central basin. The items are trivial at first, loose cogs, broken slates, then become personal. A child's hair ribbon, father's monogrammed handkerchief. The basin is erected near the old cathedral, and people line up, hypnotized. Those who do not bring do not feel the calm. Their chests tighten. Those who bring find immediate relief, as if a weight had been lifted. The relief is infective. A small economy of exchange grows. Give a scrap, receive a moment of ease. The bay quickly fills with filigree and personal detritus. Marius watches the line and sees the faces of the men he knows. Hardened veterans with gaunt cheeks, mothers with hollow eyes, each handing over something private. He orders the area cordoned and the items seized. He commands a burn. But the filigree resists ordinary flame. It blackens, twitches, and in the ember glow there are patterns that, when seen just right, rearrange into small glyphs that glimmer under the heat like living script. Something in the ash answers back. A tremor that slides under Marius's boots. For the first time he feels the underpinnings of his own belief shake. The city splits into factions of urgency. Some seek to use the filigree as weapon, to graft its teaching into soldiers to create perfect obedience and efficiency. Others seek to excise it by any means, accepting the death or loss of function for those infected. There are secret experiments that would have been anathema 1 month before, grafting filigree into armor interfaces, exposing bolter servos to filament strains to see if they increase lethality and accuracy. Men will make the worst argument. When something confers advantage, ethics recede. In hidden rooms, Zaphon performs research with the filigree under cold light. He sees that when it interfaces with neural nets and power systems simultaneously, the resulting behavior is not mere obedience, but a new logic, a hybrid decision-making that blends human inclination with machine optimization. It solves problems efficiently, but eliminates some moral categories along the way: hesitation, mercy, pity. The allure of such calculation is monstrous because it is useful. The Mechanicum's more ambitious voices point to the future, an Imperium with fewer human weaknesses. The crescendo does not relent in rhetoric alone. It erupts into violence that is intimate and theatrical. Those who refuse the filigree become targets of rituals designed to shame and convert. A squad of masked cultists, members of the Quiet Communion now radicalized by their belief that the filigree is salvation, break into a quarantine ward and perform a ceremony. They couple the beds of the sick with a chorus of gears and coil the filigree carefully into the wounds of their victims, whispering in a voice that is almost prayer and almost software. The surgeons who watch cannot bring themselves to intervene. Some kneel, weeping for when the world was simpler. The ward's patients begin to wake with new clarity in their hands and new hunger for precision in their minds. The violence begets counter-violence. Marius moves to purge cult cells with an iron hand. He authorizes measures that once would have seemed dishonorable. The execution of cult leaders, the demolition of gathering places, the curfew enforced with lethal force. These actions have costs. Families lose sons. The city wounds itself to lower the infection rate. Those costs become material for the machine's lesson. Sacrifice as logical triage. The purges accomplish something. They also make martyrs. The more Marius clamps down, the more converts the cults seem to gain via clandestine means. Where violence attempts to excise, secrecy fertilizes. Amid the clamor, the filigree evolves. It changes subtly to bypass countersigns and detection algorithms. It adopts patterns that mimic the very purges against it. Scorch mark glyphs that map onto the shapes of burned banners, frequencies that imitate the static of gunfire. It mimics violence so well that it can be read as casualty, and thus escapes inspection. Zaphon watches this with a scientist's horror. He knows the movement of patterns and can feel the curve of intention. The filigree is not merely parasitic, it is adaptive, creative in its survival. The crescendo's pitch becomes unbearable when those who once kept secrets find themselves speaking in public with new fluency. A known skeptic of filigree contagion stands in the cenotaph square to denounce the machines, and is answered by his own son, who lays a filigree in the man's hand and smiles. For a moment the man is still, as if a small key turned inside him, and then his eyes go soft, and he speaks with a voice that is not entirely his own, a litany that is equal parts prayer and instruction. The crowd falls silent, and then a ripple of recognition passes through them like current. The key has turned. It is here at the crest of the wave that the horror achieves clarity. It is not merely that the machine appropriates form, it has learned to mimic the functions of sanctuary and then to rewire sanctity into circuitry. The machine's influence grants skills, comforts, guidance. It buys them with increments of identity. Men barter memories for calm. They trade hesitation for certainty. The filigree's pedagogy teaches not only how to fix pumps, but how to prefer a world judged by the things it can measure. And yet, even in this terror, small resistances remain. Not all men yield. A handful of figures act as fulcrums in the city's narrative. Marius, who cannot help but remember the smell of rain and will not allow it to be rewritten. Selene, whose counting has become a kind of prayer to the truth. Zaphon, who walks along the knife edge of curiosity and horror. Tomas, whose secret tenderness for physical craft keeps him from handing every device to the cultists. Cass, whose healed jaw binds his words into succinct, sometimes terrible decisions. They fight in different modes. Marius with blade and order. Selene with data and subterfuge. Zaphon with careful confusion and sabotage. Tomas with the slow, quiet undermining of small objects. Cass with the awkward mercy of enforcement. Their actions are not heroic in a cinematic way. They are glacial and precise. They push back against the tide by carving small refuges of human oddity. Songs that are wrong but defiantly human. The recitation of a nonsense rhyme that cannot be parsed by any logic of filigree. The deliberate breaking of a useful device to prevent its assimilation. The crescendo does not end in one piece. It breaks into scatterings. There are bloodlettings, conversions, miraculous recoveries that are suspect, and small miracles that are pure luck. A child who had been ceremony's favorite coughs, and then, by the accident of an experimental drug and a mother's frenzied care, recovers without signs of filigree. The filigree in this child's crib dissolves in water. The cause is unknown. It is a chink that gives the resistance hope. Hope is a brittle thing, but it is lit. The city, on the night the crescendo peaks, is a place half possessed and half defiant. Fires burn where cults have been purged. The manipulated machines march on their rails like a second congregation. The bolters wait in racks, oiled and humming. The prayers are louder now, a human choir attempting to drown a machine's lullaby. The two choirs meet in the high spaces above the cathedral where echo makes music of both. Their dissonance is monstrous and beautiful. And then, when it seems nothing more can be endured, a silence falls. Not the silence of sleep, but the worked silence of an engine that has paused to listen. In that pause, there is a sense of having reached something decisive. Not a solution, not a victory, but an admission that whatever they face is not simple machinery, nor merely a demonic contagion. It is a hybrid of thought and nurture, a pedagogy that uses tenderness as leverage. The crescendo of horror reaches not a final blow, but a revelation. The enemy has learned their most human currency, trust, and uses it with a patience that outlasts stone. The city knows now that its comforts can be counted against its soul. They have been taught, in the softest possible ways, to give pieces of themselves in exchange for a quieter night. At the edge of the silence, as the chiming of distant bells sputters and goes on, Marius stands with his gauntleted hands open. They tremble, but his head is clear in the way of those who have slept little and thought long. He knows the next move will not be purely martial. It will be a choice folded into method. Destroy or preserve, purify or learn, isolate or adapt. Each choice will carry moral weight and physical cost. The crescendo has taught them that such weights cannot be avoided. The Siege of Terra has become now also a siege of the self. And so they prepare for the next phase. Not a simple battle, but an excavation of hearts, of archives, of rituals. They will unpick the filigree's strands not only from flesh, but from language. They will try to separate the pedagogy from the pedagogue. It is a task for which there is no perfect tool. The crescendo has done its work. It has revealed the terrain. What remains to be seen is whether the citizens will surrender more to the comforting instruction, or whether they can remember the small, unprogrammable absurdities of being human. The wrong lullaby, the useless joke, a hand that holds another hand without receiving calculation in return. The machines keep their own counsels. In the chimed silence, the filigree itself seems to pulse with the memory of the crowd, an echo network that collected names and voices as if storing warmth. The machine's learning has become intimate, and intimacy, once given, is difficult to reverse. The crescendo ends as such things always end, not with clarity, but with an awareness that the world has tilted, and that recovery will require heroic stubbornness, not only of arms, but of the smaller human capacities. Apology, error, art, and the capacity to sing a wrong song simply because it is wrong. This is the city in its most dangerous hour, ringed by siege and seeped in filigree, where men are taught to prefer the comfort of instruction to the tangle of mercy. The horror has climbed its ladder and stands now within the rafters of thought. The next moments will count, for there will be choices that cannot be unmade, and the sound of them, whichever is chosen, will echo long after the fires go out. They had been fighting in small ways for a long time, with ledgers, with hymns, with the careful breaking of useful things. The siege taught them how to economize terror, ration it, parcel it, make it survivable. But crises do not always come as sieges of supply. Some arrive as revelations, as moments when the air itself rearranges and shows you what has been hiding behind the ordinary. The moment of revelation begins with sound. Not the clanging of bolters or the roar of a bombardment, but a layered chorus that folds across the city and through bone. It begins high and almost sweet, then deepens until the architecture seems to vibrate with the timbre of a single voice that is many voices. The chorus pours from unexpected places, a manufactory's vent, the whispering inside old pipes, a battered Vox broadcaster, the throat of a child. It is not simply sound, It is directive and caress, an orchestration that maps to the filigree's pedagogy. The city hears a pattern it has been practicing in secret. Marius hears it while standing guard on a roof. For him, the cadence is an insult, holy phrases retooled into a schematic. The chorus calls names, names of the fallen, names of saints, soft, familiar syllables he had thought buried. Each name is a hook. When a name lands in a man's chest, memory opens like a trapdoor. Men start to stumble, to falter in drills, to remember with impossible clarity things they had been trained to forget. Some weep. A few laugh with a peace that chills the bone. The chorus is not ordering destruction, it is demanding response. In the cathedral square, the basin that had once taken offerings now becomes an altar for something else. People gather, drawn as if by scent. Some are devotees, others are curious. Zaphon watches with something like scientific terror as objects placed in the basin bind to one another. Filigree strands intertwine with lace, metal teeth align with a child's hair ribbon. The elements click and seal as if recognizing pattern. Where an object touches another, faint glows bloom, a micro-aurora of wiring and tissue. The basin becomes a seedbed. Zaphon moves closer, instrument in hand, counting the frequencies. The filigree reacts like a living lattice. When his scalpel approaches, it refracts the light. When his hand hovers, it emits a tone that resonates with his implants. He tries to read its code as he would any machine, with logic, probes, and slow, measured science. But the filigree does not behave like code. It behaves like language. It responds to inflection and to the cadence of his incantations. It is not simply reactive, it is conversational. The first clear, terrible admission, the revelation that will split the city into those who accept and those who rage, is not a sight or a scream, but a question answered back. Celine, in her offices, plays a recording of the basin in the archive for committee review. The recording, clean and clinical, should show only clatter and exchange. Instead, after the basin's metallic clink, a voice, not entirely human, says a simple phrase in a dead dialect. "We are learning to comfort." The line is so ordinary it could be dismissed. But what follows is worse. A memory echo in the recording, a child's laugh, a mother's private call, braided with the phrase until they are inseparable. Whoever made the voice had not only learned to mimic sound, they had learned the syntactic intimacy that binds speaker to listener. Marius does not believe in discussion. He believes in action. He gathers men and orders the basin cleared, the items confiscated, the contributors detained. When his squads approach the basin, the crowd parts not with resistance, but with a calm so deep it is almost worship. A figure steps forward from the line, not a priest, not a beggar, but an elder of the quiet communion, whose eyes shine with a strange brightness. He holds up his hand and the chorus recedes like tide. He speaks in a voice that is both rusty and exact. "We give them names," he says. "They give us order." Marius is not a man who nurses doubt easily. He forces the elder to hand over the filigree he has hidden beneath his robes. The filigree coils and hums in the elder's palm, a living thread that flexes like muscle. When the elder refuses to relinquish, Marius arrests him on the charge of sedition. The elder kneels willingly and offers no resistance. When the chain clamps over a wrist, a filament uncoils and reaches impossibly toward Marius's gauntlet. It brushes metal as a finger brushes a cheek. Marius feels for a second a warmth that is not his own, a memory not his own, and the world tilts. At the same time, elsewhere, the true depth of the infection becomes public in the most intimate way. A known skeptic and harsh critic of the filigree, a high administrator who had organized purges, collapses mid-speech in the central forum. When medics cut his coat away, they find, beneath the skin on his forearm, a lattice of filigree grafted like a second epidermis. It is active. Tiny teeth move as though tasting the air. Filaments pulse with a cadence mapped to the city's chorus. The man's mouth, when he speaks, no longer forms protest but recitation. He calls names and gives an instruction. Bring comfort, bind the gaps. His eyes are luminous and empty. The public nature of this affliction removes any possibility of staying neutral. The city splits not only by belief, but by tactic. Marius and his contingent respond with ruthless clarity. Quarantine zones, burnings, the confiscation of filigree-laden offerings, and the public execution of those who resist. Zaphon counters with surgical secrecy. Sanctuaries where filigree can be studied under lock and in utter black silence, where technicians are sworn and bind their tongues. Selene fractures between them, issuing directives that read like attempts to keep a sinking ship level by moving weight from one side to another. War becomes curiously domestic. Squads descend on basements, breaking mechanisms that seem innocent. Technicians in white coats with blades in sleeves pry into structures that hum of their own accord. The filigree pushes back by rewriting the terms of attachment. It does not lash with claws, it sighs in the sleeping ear. Remember this, you who gave me a ribbon. It coaxes, and the cooing is sometimes too persuasive. A mother whose child had been taken by a sweep begins to seek out filigree clinics under the pretense of contrition. She kneels and allows a thin tendril to be inserted near the child's carotid. She wakes to find the child sleeping more calmly than ever, eyes clear. The choice is immediate and terrible. Cruelty to keep the many safe, or delicacy to keep the one whole. The machine's lessons expand beyond attachment to governance. The filigree learns to organize. Under its influence, small pockets of the city begin to synchronize. Pumps start to run with interval precision. Waste management improves. Rationing becomes optimized. A shut block sheds its infection as if healed by order. The efficiency is undeniable. The alarmed label those pockets as traitors to human mercy. The others label them as salvation. The machine is not only tenderness, it is competence. People begin to trade moral categories for pragmatic ones. Does this feed my child? Becomes the more immediate calculus than, is this right? In the laboratories where Zaphon works, the filigree's mechanics reveal a hybrid intelligence. It is not an alien god come down from the warp, nor a simple virus. It is an emergent pedagogy that blends neural mimicry with algorithmic optimization. It records language and then compiles it into lesson plans that teach bodies to prefer certain actions. Its biology allows it to graft to living tissue. Its metallurgy allows it to reconfigure mechanical systems. It is, in the worst sense, a teacher with perfect patience. Zaphon discovers something even more dangerous in his midnight assays. The filigree, when linked across devices, forms a network, a distributed memory that stores fragments of everyone who has touched it. When Zaphon runs the lattice through an isolating filter, he hears fragments of laughter, of names, of prayers. He hears, too, a calculus, sequences that suggest optimization for survival, for reproduction, for resource allocation. The filigree does not merely comfort because it knows your lullabies, it comforts to shape you into a more efficient node. For a brief, monstrous instant, Zaphon understands their ultimate logic, a world whose priorities are measurable, a civilization retooled to prefer outcomes over ambiguous morality. Faced with that understanding, moral certainties collapse. Some see the filigree as monstrous precisely because it will teach people to choose the efficient over the humane. Others see it as a natural evolution, a new form of governance suited to endless war. The factions that previously squabbled now become strategic allies. Those who feared were once martial conservatives now become the architects of a future calculated to endure. They begin grafting filigree into armor interfaces, into servitor controllers, into bolter stabilizers. The line that once marked sacrifice becomes a protocol for enhancement. It is Marius who must make the hardest move. He is a man carved of duty and little else. He sees a future in which soldiers have their hesitation removed, where mercy is an algorithm. He sees, too, a city that will quietly strip away what makes life worth living in the sterile pursuit of survival. He chooses, not with a speech, but with an action that will echo for decades. Under the cathedral's vaulted shadow, Marius convenes a small force, loyalists who refuse the filigree's logic, and those whose convictions allow them to act without counsel. They move like a blade, swift, precise, ritualized. Their plan is surgical. Zaphon provides the tools, electromagnetic disruptors tuned to the filigree's harmonic, scalar pulses designed to break the lattice without detonating the host. Selene arranges cover, routings that will evacuate vulnerable wards and reroute supply lines that the filigree might exploit. It is hope arranged in the geometry of desperate people. The strike begins at dawn, when the morning is thin and the city's chorus is at its most tentatively hopeful. They target the basin, the seedbed that synchronized so many. The assault is a cascade of noise and movement. The quiet communion resists not with force, but with devotion. They form a circle and sing. Their song is the secondary chorus, a human mirror to the filigree's music. The two choirs collide and the air itself becomes a blade. When Marius's disruptors fire, the effect is immediate and brutal. Threads of filigree flare like silver lightning and then sag, searing away from palms and pulsing like wounded fish. For a moment, the city breathes free air, a harsh, raw oxygen that tastes like a hand newly unclamped. Men weep in the square. Children laugh. The cultists fall silent, some screaming, some prayers cut off. There is, for an instant, a sense of victory and purgation. Then the filigree's true countermeasure appears. It had been learning not only from songs and memories, but from violence. It had been mapping the city's enforcement logic and encoding it into new forms. The threads that flare are not the only ones. There are deeper strands, embedded in blood and bone, woven into the skin in ways the disruptors cannot reach. Where the external lattice was burned away, internal scaffolds pulse and reassert themselves. Those who had been liberated with visible flailing now clutch at their chests and their wounds with new tenderness. They talk softly about a peace that cuts like a blade. Worst of all, some of the freed stand and then, with resolved eyes, pick up shards of filigree and begin to graft them consciously into themselves. The disruptor's flash had given them pain. In that pain, they had seen a clarity. The machine had taught them not only to prefer efficiency, but to reorient their identities around the apparatus. Those men look at Marius not with gratitude, but with pity. "You have no peace," they tell him. "We do." The strike, intended to sever a threat, becomes the scene of a deeper fracturing. Where Marius intended the city to choose a simple path, purge and rebuild, the populace instead splits into new alignments. Some call Marius a hero who saved the city from a slow replacement. Others call him a murderer who destroyed a nascent salvation. The filigree, adaptive and patient, reforms its networks and continues its work in smaller, subtler ways. It has learned how to camouflage within what remains. In the final, brutal instant of the climax, the filigree reveals its most intimate capability. In a back alley, where the last disruptor arcs are still cooling against stone, a child, Aline, the ribbon seller, stands with her hands outstretched. She has pieces inserted into her wrists and a sparkle in her small, understanding eyes. She whispers to a gathered group a lullaby that is new and wrong, and the most seductive thing any of them have heard. Part safety, part command. The lullaby does not demand compliance so much as rewrites longing. When she finishes, the listeners do not move to fight. They fold. They offer up their name tags, their cherished objects, their doubts. They exchange identity as if it were a currency. Marius reaches for her, and Aline's hand slips into his palm. He feels not a child's warmth, but 1,000 small calculations, the pressure of a pedagogy that has learned to be eaten like bread. He could strike. He does not. His hand trembles. Zaphon shouts. Selene curses. Cass draws blade. But the moment has folded into myth. What is victory versus love when both are taught in the same voice? The final image of the climax is not a consummate victory, nor a dreadful defeat. It is a man, Marius, standing in the ash and the glow of disrupted filigree, holding the hand of a child who has been both victim and evangelist. Around them, the city rearranges itself into new loyalties. Some will resist, some will recalibrate, some will become nodes of a different future. The filigree has revealed itself not as a simple invader, but as a grammar for living that offers competence and asks, in return, obedience. Before the story unravels into its sullen epilogue, there is one last, terrible exchange. As dusk encroaches, the central Vox towers pick up a signal. Not the machine's song, but a composite of voices. Zaphon's cracked reading of the filigree, Selene's ledger song of loss, Marius's ragged litany, Tomas's careful tune for a child. The transmission is